Today I want to show you how to use sessions to implement a simple user login. To start, I want to look at some code that maintains a count of how many times submit has been clicked on a page without using sessions. So here I have a global variable count. That's going to keep track of how many times the button's been clicked. So the get code for this page is simple. Just display the count. The post code is almost that simple. It increments the count before displaying it. So every time I hit submit, count goes up. If I refresh, the count won't change, but I won't forget the count. Now, because count is a global variable, any interaction with this server is going to have the same count. Even if I was on a different computer or using a different browser, which I can do on this computer, if I refresh the page, I'm going to get that count. And if I change the count from this page, it's going to be reflected on this one. This would be analogous for Amazon to have all users share the same shopping cart for checkout. Not ideal. So now we're going to look at code that does away with the global count and instead has sessions maintaining the count. So here there is no global variable. But every time I come to the page, I look at the session object inside of my request. Session is actually stored in the database, and it writes a special identifier, a cookie, that contains a long string to the browser. That cookie comes back, and Django automatically takes that special identifier, goes to the database, and loads all the key value pairs that have been stored in that cookie, or in that session. So I'm asking in this line of code, could you get from the session a key value pair where the key is count? If you don't find it, instead return 0. If I didn't have the optional second argument and there was no count in the session, this line of code would throw an exception. I don't want that. So this call to get will return whatever value is stored in count, if there is such a value. If there is not such a value, it returns 0. The get request doesn't change anything. It simply displays the count just as before. And the post request does change something. It updates the count. Now this is a local variable. There is no global count anymore. So if I want the change to be viewed, I need to save it in the session. So I've created a key in the session name count. I pair it with a value that whatever integer is stored in count. and then I save that session to the browser. Finally, you don't want sessions to last forever. If you walk away from a browser and a day later someone opens it up and visits the same website, they shouldn't see your information. So you can set an expiration date, if you wish, for a cookie, or a time at which the cookie will become stale and ignored. So the set expiry method does that, and you can pass it a variety of different objects. I'm passing it a count of how many seconds will go by before that session expires. So after 5 seconds of inactivity, the session expires, and effectively count will go back to 0. So every time I hit submit, count is being updated in the session. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But if I refresh after 5 seconds, it goes back to 0. It's expired. If I refresh after less than 5 seconds, it does not go back to 0. I remember the count. Oops. If you don't change the session, and refreshing does not change the session, that 5-second count doesn't restart. So every time I hit refresh, I'm not really maintaining the session. I have to hit submit to maintain the session the way my code is written, because I'm not saving anything to the session on a get. And I could change that. So now I am changing the session even on a get, so refreshing will maintain the session. And if I hit refresh, even if 5 seconds pass, count will not go back to 0. Now if I stop hitting refresh and 5 seconds pass, count will go back to 0. Let's take the set expiration out for now. Get the count up. Get the count up to something. Now if I open a new browser window in this browser, it'll see that count. The cookie that maintains the session is stored in the browser's local cache of data, its temporary directory. And this new browser window, or tab in this case, has the same cookie, sends the same cookie back to the server, retrieves the same session data. If I go to a different browser, however, it's like being on a different computer. So this window is connected to the before project, the one that doesn't have sessions. That uses a global variable, so it's going to see the exact same count that is stored in that global variable. But the after project, this one uses cookies. So it has a different cookie storing a different session ID. So the count stored in the session associated with the cookie on this browser is still 0. And changing it has no effect on the count in the other session. So Edge has 22, but if I go back to Chrome, it's 19. Doesn't see that 22. Now a different window on Chrome will see the Chrome count, so that'll keep counting from 35, 36, 37. That's how you can have different browser sessions maintain data. And I'm going to put that expiration code back. So that when you review this code online, it's there. All right, finally, we would like to be able to maintain state not simply by that cookie, but using that cookie, that session, to keep track of a user. So now, the third version of this count project has added a new field to the form, name. What my code does is the first time we visit the page with a GET request, it checks and sees if there is a session stored, and it gets the name from that session. Of course, if there is no name in that session, this function will return an empty string. An empty string evaluates to false in Python. So I'm asking if n is not the empty string, then I have a username. So retrieve that user from my database. I've created a model for users. Get the count from that model instance. On the other hand, if n is an empty string, well, this user hasn't visited before, so count is 0. And then I'll display that information. The current count, I'm not changing the current count, I'm just displaying it. No incrementing happened. So if you've already been here, here's the count where you last left it. If you've never been here before, count is 0. And I will place the name you typed inside of the session. Now when that name gets sent as a post to the system, here we'll type a new name. Post then looks to see if there is an object of that name. If there is, great. Retrieve that object and increment its count. If there isn't, and that was the case here, we're going to create a new object, a new user object with the name that we get from the post request and the count that we just incremented, or in the case that we're getting from the post request, set it equal to 1. We just incremented it. So I don't have a count variable to assign here, but if I did, it started out at 0 and I just added 1 to it. So whether I just created this user or I retrieved it from the database and then updated it, I do want to then save it to the database. And I will make sure the session has that user's name in it. Now the template code has changed. I added this name field to the form, and I'm making sure that the value of that name field is set to the name in the session. just as the count is set to the count from the user, or 0 if no user exists. So I'm filling that form field in for the user. They can type over it, they can change it, but I'm setting it to the current name every time the form is displayed. That way I can just keep hitting submit, and Amy keeps getting a new count. Now if I switch to a different user and hit submit, the count goes down to 1. That user hasn't visited before, the count goes down to 1, and now it goes up. But if I go back to Amy, I remember Amy's count. All of this is happening in the same session. Within that session, the username is changing, but I haven't changed the session ID. I've changed the user itself. If I go to another computer, or another browser in this case, it has a different session. It has to. It's got a different cache of cookies. Nonetheless, in my strange, different new session, if I say my name is a known name, that name is retrieved from the database and the value gets incremented. So even though I'm operating through a different session, I'm storing to the same user object in the database and incrementing the count associated with that user. So if I go back to Chrome and refresh, the count will change, reflecting all the work I did in Edge. If there was more than one page in this site, all my views would have to begin checking for user. For every page, the first thing I want to do is figure out who's logged in. Then I'll decide if I want to display the rest of the page or not. Maybe that user doesn't have permission to see this stuff. But I always want to make sure I figure out who's logged in and retrieve their information from the database. So this is a similar, simpler but similar project to what you have to do for Module 6. Hopefully this walkthrough gets you started, and of course the code is all posted already in Canvas. Send emails if you have questions.